Imagine a silent night, lit only by the stars scattered above the mountains of Samaria. The camera slowly moves across olive groves, glides over ancient ruins, and draws near to a deep well, its stones worn by centuries of time. The faint sound of the wind echoes as if carrying forgotten secrets. It is here that we meet a people who have always lived between two worlds, neither fully Jewish nor entirely foreign. The Samaritans, figures marked by one of the oldest and most enduring rivalries in biblical history. But who were they, really? And why did they bear such a heavy burden of disdain? To understand this, we must journey back through centuries of wars, deportations, and unlikely alliances. We must step into a world of religious disputes, political rivalries, and cultural tensions that shaped not only the history of Israel, but also the very pages of the New Testament. The Samaritans were often described as the half-brothers of the Jews. They shared roots in the same land, claimed to worship the same God, and yet were regarded as impure, traitorous, a distortion of Israel's true identity. For the Jews, the Samaritans embodied an open wound in their national story. For the Samaritans, the Jews were arrogant, exclusive, and unjust. This mutual hatred lasted for centuries, forging one of the most hostile divisions of the ancient world. And do not think this story was a minor detail in history. In the time of Jesus, the rivalry between Jews and Samaritans still burned like fire hidden beneath ashes. Every gesture, every encounter, carried the weight of centuries of resentment. It was on this hostile ground that meetings took place which would forever transform the understanding of faith and spiritual identity. Prepare yourself, for in this journey we will uncover the origins of this people, their beliefs, their conflicts, and above all, how they emerge in the biblical narrative as a symbol of something far greater. Humanity's struggle between exclusion and reconciliation, prejudice and love, tradition and renewal. And just when you think you understand who the Samaritans were, you will discover that the story is far more complex, and perhaps in some way, we all carry a fragment of their story within ourselves. The story of the Samaritans begins with a national tragedy. Centuries before the time of Jesus, Israel was already divided into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, called Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom, called Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem. This division was not only political, but also spiritual. Each kingdom developed its own identity, its own centers of worship, and alliances with foreign nations. From the beginning, the north was accused of being unfaithful to God, especially for building altars outside Jerusalem and adopting practices regarded as pagan. The decisive blow came in 722 BC, when the mighty Assyrian Empire invaded the northern kingdom. Samaria was besieged, and after 3 years of resistance, the city fell. The consequences were devastating. Much of the population was deported to far-off lands, scattered across the Assyrian Empire. In their place, the Assyrians brought peoples from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim to inhabit the conquered territory. This was a deliberate strategy of the empire, mixing populations in order to weaken national identity and prevent future uprisings. It was in this melting pot of ethnicities that the Samaritans were born. The Israelites who remained in the land intermarried with these foreigners, blending cultures and religions. From the Jewish perspective, this was nothing less than corruption of the pure worship of Yahweh. The biblical account in 2 Kings 17 describes this syncretism. The new inhabitants feared the Lord, but at the same time continued serving their own gods. To the Jews, the Samaritans became half-breeds, spiritually impure, the result of compromise. But the Samaritans told their story differently. They insisted they were not foreigners at all, but the true descendants of the tribes of Israel who had remained in the land. To them, their worship represented the continuity of Israel's most ancient tradition, rooted in the mountains of Ephraim and Shechem, long before Jerusalem rose to prominence. Two opposing perspectives, two claims to legitimacy, and a rivalry that would mark centuries of history. What was born from deportation and cultural fusion was not merely a new people, but an identity in dispute. While the Jews of Judah saw themselves as guardians of pure faith in Jerusalem, the Samaritans claimed to be the authentic heirs of the promise, the legitimate children of the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, two peoples, one origin, and a resentment that grew deeper with every generation. And here we encounter the first great question: who has the right to call themselves the true Israel? This question was not left to ancient debates. It shaped identity, inflamed prejudice, and centuries later formed the backdrop of the encounters between Jesus and the Samaritans. One of the most striking differences between Jews and Samaritans centered on the question of worship. For the Jews, Jerusalem and its temple were the only legitimate place of sacrifice. But the Samaritans pointed to another sacred site, Mount Gerizim, near Shechem. According to them, it was not Jerusalem, but Gerizim that God had chosen for his dwelling. They claimed that this was where Abraham had prepared to sacrifice Isaac, where Jacob had built an altar, and where Israel had renewed the covenant upon entering the promised land. In their eyes, Jerusalem was a later invention, the work of David and Solomon. Gerizim, however, was the cradle of true faith, the ancient mountain of blessing, chosen by God himself. Thus, the Samaritans built their own temple on Gerizim, establishing a parallel system of worship. For the Jews, this was nothing less than heresy, an affront to the very heart of their identity. Only in Jerusalem, they believed, could God's presence truly dwell. What had begun as political and cultural rivalry now became theological war. This conflict reached its climax around 128 BC, when John Hyrcanus, a ruler of the Hasmonean dynasty, marched against Samaria and destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. For the Samaritans, this was not merely an act of war, it was an unthinkable desecration, a wound carved into their very soul. Imagine their pain. The place they believed had been sanctified since the days of Abraham and Moses, reduced to ashes by their own kin. From that moment, reconciliation became impossible. The hostility was no longer just history. It was a scar, a memory of humiliation and loss, passed down from generation to generation. Despite rejection and hostility, the Samaritans held fast to their identity. They preserved their own version of the Torah, known as the Samaritan Pentateuch, written in a script distinct from Jewish Hebrew. For them, only the 5 books of Moses carried divine authority. The prophets and the writings, so revered by the Jews, were rejected. Even today, the Samaritan Pentateuch remains one of the oldest witnesses to the biblical text, containing variations that often highlight Mount Gerizim as the chosen place of worship. This meant that, in practice, the Samaritans saw themselves as the true guardians of Moses' law. While accusing the Jews of distorting the faith by centralizing worship in Jerusalem and adding other scriptures to God's word. Thus, by the time of Jesus, the hostility between Jews and Samaritans had centuries of fuel behind it. They avoided one another whenever possible. Jews traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem would often take long detours around Samaria rather than set foot on Samaritan soil. And when their paths did cross, suspicion and insults were never far away. To call someone a Samaritan was, for a Jew, one of the worst possible offenses. The Samaritans, then, were not just neighbors. They were reminders of betrayal, compromise, and rivalry, living symbols of division within God's people. It was within this climate of hostility that the Gospels record some of the most striking encounters of Jesus' ministry. In John 4, for instance, Jesus pauses at Jacob's well in Samaria and speaks with a Samaritan woman. That alone was scandalous. A Jewish rabbi conversing not only with a woman, but with a Samaritan woman, and one whose life carried its own stigma. Their dialogue touches the very heart of the ancient dispute. Where is the true place of worship? On Mount Gerizim, as the Samaritans claimed, or in Jerusalem, as the Jews insisted? Jesus answers with words that transcend centuries of division. The hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. With this, he dismantles the old rivalry. Worship is no longer bound to geography, ancestry, or tradition. It is about the heart, the spirit, and the truth. Another moment that shook his listeners was the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10. To Jewish ears, the very phrase Good Samaritan was almost a contradiction. The Samaritan was the despised figure, the enemy. Yet in Jesus' story, it is the Samaritan, not the priest, not the Levite, who stops to help the wounded man on the roadside. The one considered impure becomes the model of compassion, while the religious elite fail to embody the very law they claim to defend. And in Luke 17, when Jesus heals 10 lepers, only one returns to thank him, and he is a Samaritan. The outcast, the despised, becomes the very example of gratitude and faith. In each of these encounters, the Samaritan is no longer the outsider to be rejected, but the unexpected vessel of God's grace. The Samaritans, despised and rejected for centuries, became in the gospel a living parable of reconciliation. They remind us that God often chooses precisely those whom society casts aside to reveal his truth. In them, Jesus shattered boundaries that seemed unbreakable. He showed that the true family of God is not defined by blood, tradition, or sacred geography, but by faith, love, and the openness of the heart. The Samaritan became the symbol of the neighbor, the one we least expect, the one we are tempted to despise, but who reveals the very heart of God. Few know this, but the Samaritan people did not vanish from history. They survive to this day, a small community of just a few hundred, divided between Nablus, near Mount Gerizim, and the city of Holon in Israel. They still keep their version of the Torah, celebrate Passover with sacrifices on Gerizim, and preserve a tradition that claims to go back more than 3,000 years. Though small and fragile, they remain a living witness to this story of division and endurance, a reminder that history is not erased by hatred, but preserved by memory. The story of the Samaritans is not merely a historical detail in the Bible. It is a mirror held before us. It asks, who are the Samaritans in our world today? Who are those we reject, despise, or consider beyond the reach of God's grace? And more, in how many ways do we ourselves live as Samaritans, bearing wounds of rejection and yet longing for reconciliation? What Jesus revealed at the well of Samaria still echoes across time. True worship is not about temples or mountains, but about a heart open to the Spirit and to truth. Thus the Samaritans stand as a call to overcome prejudice, to open ourselves to the other, and to discover that God's love always flows beyond the walls we build. If this message has brought new light to you, subscribe now and turn on notifications so we can continue this journey together through the most mysterious figures in the Bible. God bless your life.